Great. All right. Hi, everybody. Wish that we could be there in person, but unfortunately, we weren't able to travel. But we're really excited to present to you today about operationalizing stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization, or SSVC, which if I filibuster long enough by saying the full name of SSVC, I hardly even have to talk to you at all today. But we're really excited about it. Again, I know that there might be some issues with presenting virtually. I can see three and a half people. So if you have an issue, you can't hear me. I did just see someone raise his hands in a blue shirt. Thanks for that in the front row. Appreciate you. If there's an issue with sound or awesome, thank you. If there's an issue with sound or video, please raise your hand, let us know, and we'll try to stop our tracks and get us back on. But little introduction. My name is Lindsey Cerkovnik. I'm the branch chief of vulnerability response and coordination here at CISA within the Cybersecurity division and the vulnerability management subdivision. If you were at my talk yesterday, you saw that my team is responsible for CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities, or CEV catalog, the coordinated vulnerability disclosure process. We are also responsible for the CVE program, assigning CVEs through CVD, acting as a CNA of last resort, or a CNA LR through the CVE program. We do SSVC scoring. Obviously, that's what we're going to talk to you about today. But we couldn't do anything that we do without our partnerships across the organization and out in the world. So I will turn it over to my colleague, Sean Letona, to introduce himself as well.
Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you, everybody, for giving me this opportunity to come talk to you all again. As Lindsey had mentioned, really sorry that we couldn't travel down there, but happy to be able to present to you nonetheless. So my name is Sean Letona, and I'm the Chief of Operations for Vulnerability Management. And really what that means is I take all of the great work that Lindsey and her team are doing, as well as all the great work that the other branches within vulnerability management are doing, coordinate them across the cybersecurity division within CISA, all the way across CISA, and then out into our various stakeholders, which include the federal government and critical infrastructure. So if we can just jump over right to the next slide, I'll talk very briefly about who VM is, who vulnerability management is, what we do writ large, and then talk about our stakeholders. So as you can see, VM's mission is not like a traditional vulnerability management mission in an enterprise organization, right? We have a little bit of a unique responsibility. So our job in VM within CISA is to reduce the prevalence and impact of vulnerabilities and exploitable conditions across enterprise and technologies through assessments and coordinated disclosure of vulnerabilities reported by trusted partners, right? So that means that our job is very much left of an incident, but across a broad spectrum of stakeholders. Our stakeholders include the federal civilian executive branch. You'll hear us refer to that as the FCEB. Multiple agencies within the state, local, tribal, and territorial community, as well as critical infrastructure sectors all the way across the country. And we really try to feed into those high-level national security objectives from the cyber perspective. Lindsey and I are focused, again, like I said, on this within the cybersecurity division. So our particular mission space does have a cyber nexus, which is super duper important, as I'm sure we're all aware. So what are some of the things that we bring to the table within VM? So as Lindsey had mentioned, not only do we have the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog and the coordinated vulnerability disclosure platforms and processes, we also have our automated scanning capabilities. We have the pen testers, we have the red teamers, and then we have our security at scale group, which is really trying to drive scalable security measures across the entire ecosystem. So some of the tools that we leverage, in addition to having technical SMEs and hands-on experts, we feed into some of the messaging that you may see coming from CISA, right? So we support on the federal government side of the house, we support the development of our binding operational directives. We support bringing the CEV catalog to the table, right? And if you weren't aware, the CEV catalog that Lindsey and her team manage is actually supported and enforced throughout the federal government via binding operational directive that mandates organizations or federal agencies take specific action within a certain reasonable time frame. We also host a weekly SOC call where we brief out emerging priorities and up-and-coming vulnerabilities that have our attention to a broad audience of about 600 or 700 FSEB members, CISOs, CIOs, and technical SMEs across the board. On the SLTT and critical infrastructure side of the house, we really help to drive messaging, not only through alerts and cybersecurity advisories, but through targeted notifications, very specific guidance. You may have seen some of our mitigation guidance or our hunt guides go out. VM plays an important role in ensuring that all those technical details are outlined and described accordingly. And then working with Lindsey's team, one of the core questions that we seek to answer and that we're really driving to with this particular presentation is how do we prioritize? How do we rack and stack all of these vulnerabilities that we're doing our very best to monitor, bring to the table, and offer good guidance, actionable guidance in a responsible manner. So if we're looking at 40,000 vulnerabilities that are disclosed every year, how do we do that? How do we bring all of that together and make sure that we are really paying attention to those that matter and those that are going to have the biggest impact? And to give you that answer, I'm going to go ahead and turn it right back over to Lindsey to let you walk through the rest of this.
All right. Hey, surprise, it's SSVC. So that's why you're here. So that's what we're going to talk about. The name of this slide is SSVC in 60 seconds. Sean's going to call me a liar because our outline says that I'm going to take 3 minutes on this slide. So it's not really 60 seconds, but that looks better than 3 minutes. So I think it would be remiss of me to talk about SSVC and not talk about CVSS, in part because for many years, CVSS was sort of the only option to use for any technical understanding or prioritization. And I hope I'm not saying anything controversial by stating for those of you in the room that CVSS is extremely useful for understanding the technical facets of a vulnerability. That vector string, in many cases, gives us some of the best information that we can get to understand the potential, like, worst case scenario technical impact of a vulnerability somewhat in a vacuum. But there are limitations when considering that vulnerability and that CVSS score and vector string for potential impact on a sort of wider set of unique stakeholders with their own environmental concerns. So we recognize that, just to give you an example, for our stakeholder set that Sean talked about in the previous slide, we recognize that the vulnerabilities that pose the biggest threat to those federal SLTT and critical infrastructure environments are actually those that are already being exploited in the wild. So how do we take that state of exploitation and that stakeholders' concerns at scale into consideration at scale in sort of a repeatable process? So several years ago, in response to this perceived gap and need, SEI, or the Software Engineering Institute, and CISA developed the Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization, or SSVC model, for prioritizing vulnerabilities in an organization. This is a decision tree model that enables an organization to walk through a repeated decision-making process. It's very repeatable. It can be consistent across well-trained analysts. And it really gives you that triage framework to determine, okay, I've got 40,000 vulnerabilities. I've got just as many, if not more, stakeholders. What do I really need to raise to them, when, and how? What this allows us to do at CISA and the way that we've implemented SSVC is that it allows us to really focus on the state of exploitation, the prevalence, and the mission impact. So I'm putting this SSVC tree up here because, first of all, I really like decision trees. I've always liked them. I like them even more now and apply them to my own sort of personal, decision-making activities in my own personal life. I think it can be really helpful, but I also wanted to show you, I'm sure it's tiny on my screen. I'm sure it's small on your screen, but I hope you can kind of follow through that. On the left-hand side, we have our very first decision point. What is the state of exploitation? You have several options, anything from none to we know it's being actively exploited. Then you start to go into automatability, technical impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the next slide, if I can get there, I'm going to show you a different breakdown of the exact same information. This is an outline of the sort of in order steps to walking through the SSVC tree as CISA uses it. This is an alternate view of the previous slide, basically, but this detailed view goes into slightly more detail about each decision point. One thing that my analysts told me, like, you have to say this, as you're presenting this, they really want to make it clear that CISA has organizationally made decisions about how they want to implement SSVC, and we share our SSVC decision tree and calculator and all the information behind it via a paper on CISA's website. But SSVC has a pretty good amount of flexibility for any organization that wants to implement it. So while the decision points may be relatively the same, or each sort of decision within those points may be relatively the same, the way that you at your organization implement it is very curatable to your organizational needs. Again, this can be found in the SSVC paper on CISA's website, which I'm going to reference later in the references if we get to that slide. So I think this is an interesting piece of information that I actually don't think a lot of people know. We've been using SSVC at CISA to prioritize vulnerabilities for 5 years. April of 2020 is when we started using it. We've seen a lot of really good successes from using SSVC. The KEV, the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities Catalog, was certainly the first one in November of 2021. And then since then, we've started sharing successfully our first 3 decision points publicly for every new CVE through enrichment and through CISA's authorized data publisher or ADP capability. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we sort of move on, but this is another view of the decision tree itself. All right, these are what we call, pardon me, these are what we call the decision outcomes. When you walk through, if you look at that tree on the previous slide, when you walk through that decision tree, you're ultimately going to end, when you walk all the way through that decision tree, all 5 decision points, when you get all the way to the end, you're going to come out with a decision outcome. We have 4 of them at CISA, and we name them as follows. We've got track, track star, which we actually call monitor internally and are working on changing our public documentation to match. Track, monitor, attend, and act. You can see on this slide that we sort of have the escalating color scheme of like a stoplight, right? So a track vulnerability is associated with green. It gives you the good feelings, and an act vulnerability is associated with red. Everybody wants to make the color coding happen, so we kind of went along with it. But essentially, these decision outcomes elevate our analysis, the technical analysis that we're doing every day, into a conversation that can be passed from one organizational group to the other. So for example, once my team does the technical analysis to determine that a CVE meets, for example, an attend or an act, we can really easily package that up with the associated decision outcome and sort of transport it off to another team to action. I will say I am aware of other certs and cert-like organizations that are much smaller than CISA that also use SSVC, and their various teams are not as perhaps disparate or large or spread out as CISA's, and they can still effectively use SSVC in this way. They just maybe have a closer, the person who does the analysis and lands on the decision may have a closer relationship or closer proximity to the person who actions it. They may even be the same person. At CISA, that's not always the case. So what does SSVC mean to CISA? I'm going to talk a little bit about it from my perspective as the person who's sort of over the analysis side and as the team who's over the analysis side. But I'm also going to pass over to Sean because, like I said in the previous slide, because we are a large organization, this responsibility of actioning and actioning the decision points and operationalizing SSVC is shared across a lot of organizational units. So first, I'll talk about the repeatability over time. The fact that we can do this at this point, we can do at least the first 3 decision points for every single new CVE is pretty fantastic. We do it the same way every time. It's very consistent across analysts. It's very consistent because we have our SSVC training guide, very consistent from team to team, and therefore the interpretation is quite consistent as well. And here I'll pass it over to Sean.
Thank you, Lindsey. Appreciate that. Okay, so after what Lindsey had said about this being consistent and repeatable over time, that is actually a very important facet when it comes to what my team does and how we execute and operationalize the information that we get from Lindsey's team. So when Lindsey and her team score something using the SSVC, score a vulnerability using the SSVC, my team then actually takes that score, brings it across CSD, and talks about what are we going to do with this information. And the good thing about SSVC is that it has given us sort of a framework to derive a menu of option. Now, we'll talk on the next slide about where some friction points might be, and some of those do still exist. But by and large, we are able to decide relatively quickly what is the action we are going to take based on the decision outcome from SSVC. Now, with CISA, again, as I had mentioned before, we don't actually take any remediation, but we do drive remediation and mitigation action, especially across the federal government. So most of our action that we take involves communication and just going down through a various menu of options that we use. Your organization may be different, but that we use to really, how are we going to deliver this message to organizations, right? I had mentioned some of the alerts that we do, some of the other products that we're able to put out as a group. But really it goes down from, are we trying to create awareness or are we trying to drive action? So on sort of the lower end, less impactful edge of this scale, we will create sort of an awareness campaign where maybe we're putting out an alert, maybe we're updating the website, maybe we are just amplifying a security advisory that we got from a vendor, and just sort of, double that, put it out and add it into our kind of weekly roll-ups. On the far more extreme end of the spectrum, we will actually drop an emergency directive. And that emergency directive will mandate that organizations within the federal government take specific action relatively quickly with very little wiggle room and within a specific time frame. Most of those are going to be obviously on your act side of the house, right? And then depending on a couple of minor factors beyond that, that's going to drive our action and really determine how do we get from A to B. Really important also, and it's up there in red because I consider it my job, and Lindsey and I talk, her team and my team, we talk very frequently. And one of the other options, not only do we have this sort of responsibility to make everybody aware of the fact that, like, look, this is bad, this is going to have impact. We need to be paying attention to this. We need to sift through the smoke and really focus on this one. We also have the obligation to spin down, right? So everybody's heard about spinning up. We also have an obligation to spin down. And SSVC really gives us a great tool to do that because, as Lindsey had mentioned, it's focused on mission impact, exploitability, and prevalence, right? Prevalence. How many of these devices, how many places do we see this vulnerability? And really, if you have a good look at that and you leverage it the right way, you can really see where these decisions are made. And I'll give you one example. One example from a couple of years ago is CVE 2023-20593, which was known within the media as Zenbleed, which was a vulnerability that affected AMD chips, right? And it was very prevalent. Billions of chips and billions of devices, right? It hit the media and there was a big giant splash. And to be quite honest with you, it kind of caught me by surprise with how high this went up within the federal government and kind of the demand signal for action that was coming down really from just one or two media articles. So when Lindsey and I put our heads together, we ran this particular vulnerability through the SSVC scoring system. We scored it as a track star, which again, if you remember from Lindsey a couple minutes ago, that just means monitor, right? So we brought that to the table across the organization, across the federal government. We explained to everybody how we got there, what was the parameters that really required exploitation of this particular CVE, and we were able to, quote unquote, walk everybody back off the ledge, right? And really that was made possible by SSVC and that scoring system. CVSS had it scored at like a 9.8. So at first glance, you say, oh, 9.8 across billions of devices, we're in all kinds of trouble. No, we're really not, right? Because the conditions that are required to exploit this didn't exist in 99.9% of those devices. Next slide, please, Lindsey.
Oh, I think first I have a picture. Sorry, this is really important to me. I have a picture of this is actually Sean in action spitting down the entire federal government about Zinbleed. Looks pretty cool. Sorry. Hey, you got to have some fun sometimes.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, yeah. So diving into prerequisites, I'm just going to take 1 second to really talk about this, and then I'll pass it along. A prerequisite to success in using the SSVC is you have to have buy-in. You have to have not only executive buy-in, but your fellow analysts that are across the organization have to understand where this came from and really what it gives them, right? As I explained way in the very beginning, vulnerability management, our team is left of an incident, right? We want to prevent something from happening. We also work very, very closely with our threat hunting colleagues and our incident response colleagues who are really tearing down the doors when something happens, right? We have spent an enormous amount of time making sure that they understand the SSVC scoring system. So even if they come across an incident, right, maybe something was exploited, we're able to go back, look at the characteristics of that vulnerability, plug it into the SSVC scoring system, and come to an understanding about where we're going to go forward on this. We've tried across the organization, especially within CSD, multiple different prioritization schemas. Within VM, we've adopted heat maps. We've tried, numerical weighted scores to get from the top to bottom. And none of that really helped us, right? And it really created a lot of confusion. And some of it was just flat out contradictory. There is some friction points using SSVC. There is room for refinement, and I'll let Lindsey get into that again in a minute. But really, if you have that total buy-in from across the organization, from across your teams, it is an incredibly valuable tool that can serve you for a very long time. Go ahead, Lindsey. Next slide, and then it's yours.
I knew I was going to do that. Muted myself so I could cough without blowing everybody's eardrums up, and I knew I was going to do that. Anyways, I've got a few more slides. I know we're running a little bit late because of technical issues, so I will try to go relatively quickly through these, and then maybe we can talk about our lessons learned as we're sort of talking through these. So I want to talk a little bit about SSVC and enrichment because if you went to my talk yesterday, or of course I referenced back to it earlier, in this conversation, but I think it's really important to try to communicate this part to you all. So with those first 3 decision points, analysts really, they go through it thousands of times, right? And so they really develop this kind of mental model where they can almost look at a vulnerability description, they can look at the CVSS, they have, mentally cataloged a good understanding of, what our sort of biggest attack surface issues are. And they can really do those first 3 decision points super fast. And then they can kind of come to a mental decision outcome super fast also. But of course, we need to do this systematically in a way so that the decision outcomes can be shared across the organization. So we do have both an internal tracking mechanism, which is just basically a ticketing system that we track on. And then we have our public, we made the decision to share publicly those first 3 decision points so that organizations could try to more, efficiently and more quickly embrace SSVC for their own decision making. Every CVE, and I have an asterisk here because there are some exceptions, but almost every CVE gets those first 3 decision points, and then that output is shared in CISA's enrichment GitHub, in the CVE record JSON, but also through also through CISA's authorized data publisher role in the CVE program. So in the original CVE record, I've got a little screenshot over on the side. It's maybe too down in the weeds for people to care. I don't know. But if you look at a CVE records ADP container within the JSON, you'll see CISA's SSVC decision, the first 3 SSVC decision points there. This is just a totally random recent CVE, but you can see exploitation is none. We assessed it to not be automatable, and we said that the technical impact was partial versus total. All right, all of that is shared publicly, but it is also synced with our internal tracking of SSVC scoring, which is not shared publicly. So on the internal side, we do the mission prevalence and well-being. A lot of this is based on what we determine to be prevalent across our stakeholder set, which, as you saw, is pretty large, but we focus really heavily on what we think is in FSEB and SLTT. And we also focus on the impact of the potential technical impact of that vulnerability on the performance of that specific technology. So some of the sources that we use for that information are quantitative. For example, we use scanning results from multiple different sort of services that we offer to FSEB. And we also have some qualitative sources for information. So we use like public acquisition records, we use market research, things like that in cases that are maybe not as clear cut. And then I put in the little like magical, tildes experience, because actually our analysts have been scoring for years. And in addition to that, they've been at CISA or with the federal government for many years in some cases, or adjacent to federal government. They really understand what technology could have a real and meaningful impact on the federal government. And then, of course, we do not share our decision outcomes publicly. Because we do those first 3 steps for every CVE, we have a really good idea of what we actually need to follow through to the end. We don't do all CVEs until follow them all through the decision tree. But my next slide, I know I need to hurry, so I'm going to try, but I'm really passionate about this part. This kind of shows you the by the numbers what SSVC does for us. For those first 3 decision points, since enrichment has started in, I think, February of 2024, we've scored something like 46,000 vulnerabilities, maybe a little bit over. Those are all enriched with those first 3 decision points publicly. They're also tracked internally. That's exploitation, automatability, and technical impact. But then of those 46,000, we actually take a pretty small amount to follow through to the actual decision outcome, because we can tell from those first 3 decision points which things are going to be relevant to CISA. I want to say under 10% of those 46,000 do we actually ingest not ingest, but do we actually take further through that decision tree process in our own internal system. Of those vulnerabilities that we further score, which I would argue is already a skewed number because we've taken things that we really think have an impact and probably will score higher, only around 8% are actually actioned. 3% land on acts. That usually means that they're exploited. Some of those end up on the KEV. And about 5% end with attends, where we do sort of further messaging to FSEB communities and even maybe to the public. And I will move on to the next slide. All right, really quickly talk about lessons learned. As the organization grows, SSVC has to grow too. I think Sean mentioned this earlier. One of the prerequisites for success is that iterative quality of SSVC and that willingness to continually improve the process. If you're running up against friction with your SSVC system, it's the system that needs to be changed, not your analysts, not your executives. It just means that system needs to be reevaluated for, appropriateness for your organization. Different trees for different triages. This is something that we've learned. Our organization is huge. Our area of responsibility is huge. We might need a tree for FSEB, and we might need a tree for, operational technology and industrial control systems technology. That is something that we're exploring right now. And then finally, this is sort of VM's, current ethos and something we care a lot about, a core pillar and tenet of our programs. We want to share what we can publicly. We're producing a lot of this information, and not all of it is sort of private information. And we feel that sharing that in the public space gives allows and enables our work to be sort of consumed as a public service. And that's something that's really important to us. I think I'm getting to the end, and I'm definitely rushing because I realize that we're 5 minutes over. But some future developments that I've already talked about. We are continuing to brief stakeholders on SSVC and how CISA implements it. We are incorporating SSVC into more tools. Full enrichment has made this way easier because people can just ingest SSVC as a JSON, as JSON, and then do kind of whatever they want with it, which is great. That feeds into the longer term. We would love to help vendors build SSVC into their risk dashboards. We have conversations with them all the time about this. I think many already are. And then I mentioned that ICS SSVC tree. That's something we're really exploring and trying to figure out what makes sense for our organization as we consider those more operational technology and sort of ICS technologies. We have some public resources. I saw a question about public resourcing. If you go to cisa.gov/SSVC, you can find our guide, and it outlines how CISA uses SSVC in our decision tree. We also have a calculator there. So I think that's a really good resource. All right, I made it to the end with only, -6 minutes to spare. I'm not in the room, so I don't know if there are questions, but I'm assuming that someone in the room might be able to kind of help us navigate. I see the question from Discord, is the SSVC training guide publicly available? Yes, we have CISA's SSVC. Thank you, Sean. CISA's SSVC resources are on the www.cisa.gov/SSVC. And if you have any questions, of course, you're welcome to email us at vulnerability@mail.cisa.dhs.gov.
Lindsey and Sean, thank you very much. We'll direct questions to Discord since we are over time. Let's give tremendous thank you to Lindsey and Sean. Thank you.